This is the story of Bobby, the man who refused to give up.
Once upon a very long time ago, in a part of Nigeria where the earth was the color of a toasted biscuit, there was a small and quiet village that sat right at the edge of a giant sleeping desert. In this village, the sun was like a big golden king who never wanted to go to sleep, and every single morning he would climb high into the sky and pour his hot yellow breath down onto the people in the trees. The ground had become so dry that it started to break into tiny little pieces, creating deep cracks that looked like thirsty mouths opening up to beg the clouds for just one small sip of rain. The beautiful green leaves that used to dance on the baobab trees had all turned brown and crunchy, falling to the sand with a quiet snap whenever the hot wind blew past them. Inside one of the little round huts, with a roof made of dried golden grass, a man named Obi woke up and wiped the sleep from his tired eyes. He reached out his hand to touch his large clay water pot that sat in the corner of his room, but when his fingers tapped the side, it made a hollow clink sound that told him there was nothing inside but dry air and dust. Obi sighed a very long and heavy sigh because he knew that all over the village, his friends and the little children were also looking at their empty pots with sad faces. He stepped outside and felt the heat of the sand tickling his toes, looking around at the elders who were sitting in the shade of their porches, fanning themselves with large leaves that were starting to wilt. The air in the village was very still and quiet because everyone was too thirsty to sing the songs they used to sing or play the games they used to play under the moonlight. Obi looked at the horizon where the sand met the sky, and he saw the heat wiggling and waving like a ghost, making the distant dunes look like they were floating in the air. He knew that if he did not do something brave and something very special, the village would soon have to leave their homes to find a place that wasn't so hot and dry. He went back inside to grab his wide-brimmed straw hat to protect his face from the sun's bright glare, and he picked up a sturdy wooden walking stick that had been carved from a very old and strong branch. As he walked past the village square, he saw a little dog lying in the dust, panting with its pink tongue hanging out, and he felt a sharp poke of sadness in his heart because even the animals were waiting for a miracle. Obi took a deep breath of the warm air and promised himself that he would walk as far as his legs could carry him until he found the secret of the water. He didn't have a map and he didn't have a horse, but he had a very strong spirit and a pair of feet that were ready to move across the golden mountains of sand. With one last look at his quiet home, he turned his back to the village and began to walk straight into the heart of the giant desert, where the sun was waiting to see just how brave he really was. Obi began his journey by climbing the first giant mountain of sand, which felt like walking on a pile of warm sugar that wanted to pull his feet down deep into the earth. The desert was so big and so wide that it looked like a never-ending ocean made of gold, and everywhere he looked, there was nothing but more sand reaching out to touch the bright blue edges of the sky. Every time he reached the top of a dune, he hoped to see a river or a lake. But all he saw were more waves of yellow dust stretching out into the distance like a giant blanket. The sun climbed higher and higher until it was sitting right on top of his head, making his shadow look like a tiny little puddle at his feet. But Obi kept moving his legs one after the other. He could hear the swish-swish sound of his walking stick poking into the sand, and he started to hum a soft tune to keep his heart from feeling lonely in the big, quiet desert. His throat began to feel very tight and scratchy, like he had swallowed a handful of dry crackers, but he remembered the thirsty faces of the children back in his village, and that gave him the strength to keep going. Sometimes the wind would blow hard and whirl the sand around him in a dizzy dance, making it hard to see his own hands, yet he never turned around to go back home. He watched the little lizards with shiny scales scurrying across the hot ground, wondering how they stayed so happy in a place that was so very dry and so very hot. As the hours passed, the bright yellow sun started to turn a deep, beautiful orange, and the long shadows of the dunes began to stretch out like giant fingers across the land. Obi's legs felt very heavy, and his muscles were singing a song of tiredness, but he told his feet to be like the wind and keep sliding forward over the hills. He felt very small in the middle of such a huge world, but he knew that even a small person can do very big things if they just keep walking and never give up on their dreams. He took a deep breath of the cooling evening air and pushed himself over one last high ridge, praying that the next valley would hold the secret he was searching for. As Obi reached the peak of the tallest sand dune he had seen all day, he blinked his eyes many times because he thought the sun was playing a trick on his tired brain. Down in the deep valley below, there was a splash of color that did not belong in the desert, a beautiful and bright emerald green that looked like a jewel dropped in the middle of the sand. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, and this time he saw the long, feathered leaves of palm trees waving hello to him in the gentle evening breeze. It was a hidden oasis, a secret garden that the desert had been keeping safe from the rest of the world, and it looked like the most beautiful place in the entire universe. Obi started to run, his feet sliding and flying down the side of the sandy mountain, sending a cloud of golden dust behind him as he hurried toward the green trees. When he stepped onto the grass, it felt cool and soft like a velvet carpet, and the air suddenly smelled sweet and fresh, like flowers blooming after a long sleep. In the center of the trees sat a pool of water that was so clear and so blue that he could see the white pebbles resting at the very bottom. He knelt down on his knees and cupped his hands together, dipping them into the water and feeling the wonderful coldness touch his skin like a magical blessing. He took a long, slow drink, and he could feel the life returning to his body, making his heart beat fast with happiness and making his eyes shine with new light. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the drip-drop sound of the water and the rustle-rustle of the palm leaves, feeling very thankful that he had found this hidden treasure. Around the water, he saw little colorful birds coming down to take a sip, and he realized that this was a place where life was hiding from the heat of the sun. He sat quietly under the shade of a tree, looking at the sparkling water and thinking about how he could share this miracle with every single person who was waiting for him back in the village. Obi knew that just finding the water was not enough, because he could not carry the whole oasis back to his village in his small hands, so he decided he had to build something strong. He went to the edge of the oasis where the rocks were flat and heavy, and he began to move them one by one to create a special place for a borehole. He found long, hollow branches and pieces of old metal that had been left behind by travelers, and he started to fit them together like a giant, clever puzzle. His hands became dusty and his shirt was covered in sweat, but he worked with a big smile on his face because he could already hear the sound of the water splashing in his mind. He dug a hole deep into the soft earth near the water's edge, using his strength to push past the sand until he reached the cool, wet ground underneath. He placed the pipes carefully into the dark hole, making sure they were straight and tight so that the water would have a clear path to travel up to the surface. He built a tall frame out of the strong wood he found, and he attached a big, heavy metal handle that would act like a magical key to unlock the water from the earth. Every time he felt tired, he would look at the clear blue pool and remember the dry, cracked ground of his home, and suddenly his arms would feel strong all over again. The sun came up and the sun went down 2 more times while Obi worked, and he did not stop until every nut was tight and every stone was in its perfect place. He stood back and looked at his creation, which was a beautiful tall machine that stood proud among the palm trees like a silent guardian of the oasis. He reached out his hand and gripped the handle, feeling the cool metal against his palm, and he took a very deep breath to prepare for the big moment. He pushed the handle down and pulled it back up, and he heard a gurgle sound coming from deep inside the earth, followed by a whoosh of air. With one more strong push of the handle, a giant silver stream of water came rushing out of the pipe, splashing onto the stones with a loud and happy clatter-clat. The water was so clear it looked like melted diamonds, and it sparkled in the sunlight as it created a new little stream that ran through the green grass. Obi laughed out loud, his voice echoing through the quiet oasis, and he knew it was time to go back and bring his people to this wonderful new home. He ran all the way back to the village, his feet moving twice as fast as before, because his heart was so light and full of the best news in the world. When he arrived at the village, he shouted for everyone to come out, and soon a big crowd of people with curious eyes gathered around him to hear what he had to say. He told them about the golden dunes, the hidden green trees, and the magical machine he had built that could give them all the water they would ever need. The people grabbed their bright blue buckets, their yellow jugs, and their brown clay pots, following Obi back into the desert in a long, colorful line that looked like a moving rainbow. Even the elders found the strength to walk, leaning on their canes and smiling because they could smell the promise of water in the warm afternoon breeze. When they finally saw the oasis and the tall borehole, the children let out a giant cheer and ran toward the water, feeling the cool spray on their faces for the first time in months. Obi stood by the handle and pumped the water for everyone, filling every single pot and bucket until the village was full of the sound of splashing and laughing. The people dipped their heads into the cool stream and felt the heat leave their bodies, and for the first time in a very long time, nobody in the village was thirsty anymore. They looked at Obi with so much love in their eyes, realizing that he had saved them all by being brave enough to walk where no one else would go. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in beautiful shades of purple, pink, and deep gold, the village decided to have the biggest party that the desert had ever seen. They built a small fire that crackled and popped, and the sound of traditional drums began to thump across the dunes, calling everyone to come together and dance. The women sang songs about the man who found the water, their voices rising high into the night sky like birds flying toward the moon. They brought out plates of delicious food that they had saved for a special day, and they ate together as one big happy family under the light of 1,000 twinkling stars. The chief of the village stood up and asked everyone to be quiet. And he placed a magnificent robe made of the finest cloth onto Obi's tired shoulders as a sign of great honor. He told the people that from this day forward, Obi would be known as the keeper of the oasis, the man who brought life back to a land that had forgotten how to be green. Obi felt a little bit shy, but very happy, looking around at the smiling faces of his friends and the sleeping children who were no longer dreaming of water. He realized that the desert was no longer a scary or empty place, but a home that was full of hope and the sound of a splashing borehole. The village eventually moved their huts closer to the oasis, and soon there were gardens full of corn and beans growing where there used to be only dry sand and dust. The borehole stayed strong and tall, always giving fresh water to anyone who was thirsty, and Obi would sit by it every evening to watch the sunset and listen to the birds. The story of the man who walked through the sun to find a miracle was told to every child, and then to their children, for many, many years to come. And so, the village lived happily ever after, always remembering that as long as they had each other and the gift of the water, they would always be strong and full of joy.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to J African Tales.